All right, let's get started. Part one, toward actualist and fundamental public justification and political liberalism. Let's take things from the top. What's public justification? Well, very roughly, to say that something phi is publicly justifiable is to say that phi is authoritatively acceptable by relevant people. Alternatively, it is to say that phi is justifiable on the basis of public reasons or reasons that are authoritatively acceptable by relevant people. In political liberalism, this refers to the equal acceptability of political things, such as conceptions of political justice or political principles or exercises of political power, by reasonable citizens. At the same time, the view that political things must be equally acceptable by reasonable citizens expresses or models an idea of what it takes to extend equal respect or a special kind of equal respect to these citizens in relevant political matters. However, it is often overlooked that first generation political liberalism, these are the views advanced by philosophers like John Rawls, Stephen Macedo, or Charles Lamore, often uses more than one idea of public justification and more than one idea of equal respect. So, the best way to start is to distinguish between two different ideas of public justification, or perhaps two different roles in which the idea of public justification is sometimes used. And after this, I'll say more about equal respect. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to distinguish between ideal and what I shall later call actualist public justification. Let's start with ideal public justification. This marks the way in which public justification is understood as part of Rawls's model of a well-ordered society. Public justification in this sense is a kind of reason giving that takes place within a hypothetical, well ordered society of reasonable citizens. This is a society that is effectively regulated or well ordered by a conception of political justice, such as Rawls's own Justice is Fairness, or JF. And the hypothetical reasonable citizens of that society already accept this conception, the conception that well orders that society, as reasonable, and they carry out public justification on the basis of that conception. If we think of public justification along such lines, then to say that something is publicly justifiable is to say something like this. Insofar as a society that is well ordered by a conception of political justice C and reasonable citizens of that society who accept that conception are concerned, phi, a relevant political thing, is equally acceptable by all reasonable citizens on the basis of C or C's political values. We can call public justification in this sense as ideal in a twofold way. First, public justification so construed is situated in a hypothetical, ideal, or highly idealized society. And second, public justification so construed includes within its justificatory constituency, on fully enfranchised footing, only the hypothetical reasonable citizens of that society who, by definition, already accept the conception of political justice as reasonable that regulates or well orders their society. When public justification is construed in these terms, it is often also construed as conception applying, or as applying a given, allegedly shared conception of political justice to relevant political matters. Now, this is not the sort of public justification that I'm interested in here. It is quite widespread to read Rawls's notion of public justification along such lines, or lines that are very closely related to these things. But it is also clear that There's much more to the theme of public justification and political liberalism than ideal and conception applying public justification. And this is what I want to focus on today. All right, this brings us to what I call actualist public justification. Political liberals sometimes refer to public justification as a form of justification or reason giving that requires equal acceptability by the actual reasonable citizens of an actual Western liberal regime, that is, in the actual world. If we picture things along such lines, then to say that something is publicly justifiable is to say something like this. For the actual citizens of an actual Western democratic society, phi, a political thing, is equally acceptable by all reasonable citizens, or perhaps all citizens insofar as they are reasonable, or at least is justifiable by reasons that are so acceptable. Public justification in this sense is actualist public justification. It is actualist in a twofold sense. First, the standard of public justification here applies to actual political reason giving in the actual world. And second, actualist public justification includes within its justificatory constituency on fully enfranchised footing actual reasonable people. This is the kind of public justification that I am interested in here. And let me briefly give you this as a picture again. So we have public justification as a matter of equal acceptability by relevant people, or as a form of justification by public reasons, or reasons that are so acceptable. And there's more than one view in the field as to what public justification in Rawls type political liberalism looks like. One common way of reading public justification in Rawls type political liberalism, public justification, one form or other, is ideal. It's a practice of public reason giving that's carried out by the hypothetical reasonable citizens of a hypothetical well-ordered society. But what I'm interested in is a different way of understanding public justification and political liberalism, an actualist understanding of it. On that understanding, public justification is a practice of public reason giving that is carried out by the actual reasonable citizens of an actual society. Okay, that's what I'm interested in. However, let me add two remarks. First, the way I just distinguished between ideal and actualist public justification marks ideal types, so I'm exaggerating the contrast. This keeps the contrast between these things sharp, but in reality, the contrast is often much less straightforward. In part, this has to do with the matter of hypotheticalization that I will touch on later in more detail. All acceptability-based justification must hypotheticalize to some degree, however minimally, and hence idealizes in one sense of the word. For it must qualify the kind of discursive input that it recognizes as authoritative or as positively or negatively contributing to justification. For instance, to be authoritative, discursive input must be respectable, thoughtful, coherent, rational, reasonable, and so forth. Now, one implication of this point is that there can be high idealization actualist justification. For instance, we might take it that some political thing phi is publicly justifiable to actual people in the actual world, only insofar as these actual people could still accept phi if they were fully reasonable citizens of a well-ordered society. Okay, so the difference between actualist and ideal justification is often complicated, but for now, it's best to keep contrasts sharp. Thus, I will assume that public justification is construed as actualist if it is construed as situated in an actual society and as fully enfranchising actual citizens. This brings me to a second remark. We saw that public justification in political liberalism fully enfranchises reasonable people. However, there's little consensus in the field about what makes people reasonable. Fortunately, only two things matter here. First, Rawls arguably assumes that reasonable citizens do not reject political liberalism's most important liberal political values. And that is whatever exactly these values might be, and I can leave this open, more or less. However, one implication here is that intelligent and conscientious citizens in good moral standing may not qualify as reasonable in Rawls's sense. And of course, this must raise concerns about the inclusiveness, or the lack thereof, of public justification in political liberalism. And we will return to this later. Okay, with this, I turn to the theme of equal respect, or perhaps two distinct ideas of equal respect. One idea comes with Rawls's model of a well-ordered society. The hypothetical reasonable citizens of Rawls's well-ordered society respect each other as equals, but they look to an allegedly reasonable conception of justice, namely justice as fairness, to define what equal respect asks them to do. And since JF prescribes that citizens engage in public reason-giving in relevant political matters, does equal respect commit them, these hypothetical citizens, to public reason-giving or public justification? Now, if we stand back a little, we can see here that this line of thought uses the idea of equal respect as a conception-dependent requirement. That is to say, it's a constraint on political conduct, the content of which is defined by or depends on a prior, allegedly reasonable conception of justice. Equal respect in this sense asks us to respect other people as equal recipients of justice. That is to say, it asks us to treat them justly, to hand out justice as defined in terms of a given prior conception of justice. Accordingly, if we construe equal respect in this way, then it commits to public reason-giving or public justification only if justice requires public reason-giving or public justification. This is how equal respect in political liberalism is often understood, especially in the current North American debate. Accordingly, theorists who disagree with Rawls's belief that equal respect commits to public reason-giving often attack Rawls by arguing that justice does not call for public reason-giving. However, there is another, more Republican or constructivist view that ties equal respect more directly to public reason. On this view, equal respect does not depend on an allegedly reasonable conception of justice, but rather constrains what conceptions of political justice can count as reasonable in the first place. In this sense, equal respect here has a conception constraining role. In one relevant form, the basic idea is that political things may be applied to people or may count as reasonable only if these things are justifiable to these people on the basis of equally acceptable reasons. Equal respect in this sense asks us to respect other people not merely as recipients of justice. Rather, it asks us to treat them as equal authorities or equal co-authors of justice and justification. The idea here is that people should be accorded a justificatory say, or some measure of discursive influence on what things can count as just, justified, or reasonable to begin with. Or to put this in terms that I will use later, equal respect in the conception constraining sense takes the form of discursive respect. It involves, according to other people, a meaningful justificatory say in relevant matters that affect them. So we can map this roughly as follows. So I just distinguish between conception, let's say, conception-dependent form of equal respect and a conception-constraining form or role of equal respect. And if we ask how does political liberalism think of the nature of equal respect, well, if we try to answer this question with a focus on Rawls's conception of public justification in a well-ordered society, then we are led to an interpretation according to which equal respect, and at least Rawls's political liberalism, um, is a form of conception-dependent equal respect. In exercising equal, in say, extending equal respect to other people, the citizens of a well-ordered society act justly as defined by a prior reasonable conception of justice. However, there's also a more Republican or constructivist idea of equal respect, where equal respect is something that constrains which conceptions of justice may count as reasonable in the first place. I assume, for the purposes of this lecture, that the commitment to actionist public justification reflects or models a commitment to conception constraining equal respect, or as I shall also call it, discursive respect. Okay? Now, a commitment to actionist public justification and conception constraining equal respect is fairly evident in the works of first-generation political liberals like Stephen Macedo and Charles Lamore. For Macedo, public justification has two basic aims. It aims to justify political things on the basis of good reasons, but it also aims to respect reasonable citizens as free and equal, where this is understood as requiring justifications on equally acceptable grounds. However, Macedo understands the first aim from the perspective of the second. In his view, political liberalism defines the goodness of good or publicly justifying reasons as, quote, entirely a function of their capacity to gain widespread agreement among reasonable people, close quote. To a similar effect, Lamore claims that equal respect is the, quote, moral basis of the liberal principle that the fundamental rules of political association are legitimate only if they can be the object of reasonable agreement, close quote. And Lamore argues that reasonable people are properly respected as equals only if the political principles that apply to them are as justifiable to them from their perspective, as he puts it, as they are to us. Now, both Macedo and Lamore here refer to actual reasonable people in the actual world, and they specify an equal acceptability condition that, they take it, applies to all public reasons and all political principles. Accordingly, these two theorists take it that conceptions of political justice are compatible with proper respect for actual reasonable citizens only if they are equally acceptable by these citizens. What I want to suggest now is that Rawls too adopts an idea of actionist public justification that expresses or models a commitment to extend a form of conception constraining equal respect, or what I called discursive respect, to actual reasonable citizens. And to give some little bit more context to this, it's useful to distinguish between three distinct levels of argument in Rawls's mature view of domestic justice. So let us then consider briefly the structure of that view. All right, so on one interpretation, Rawls addresses reasonable citizens of a Western liberal democracy and submits to their consideration answers to two global questions. The first question, Q1, is this: what must the conception of political justice be like to provide a basis for political legitimacy in a Western liberal democracy? The second question, Q2, goes like this: if such a conception must take the form of a political liberalism, as Rawls suggests in answering to Q1, what token view of that form should be adopted? Now, these questions, of course, are related. Rawls's answer to the first question, Q1, defines a framework that his answer to the second question, Q2, fills out. Now, let's look at briefly the answer, the structure of Rawls's answer to these two questions. To answer the first question, Q1, Rawls argues that a conception of justice phi can provide a basis for political legitimacy in Western liberal democracy only if phi is equally acceptable by all reasonable citizens of that society. And he claims that phi can be so acceptable only if phi meets two conditions. First, phi must be political both in scope of application form of justification, and second, phi must be liberal in content. That phi is political means roughly that phi only regulates that society's domain of the political or its most important social, political, and economic institutions, and that phi construes equal acceptability by reasonable citizens as politically justifying. And that phi is liberal in content means that phi only contains liberal political values. To make his case, Rawls argues that a conception of justice cannot be equally acceptable by reasonable citizens unless it can attain an overlapping consensus between the reasonable comprehensive doctrines that reasonable citizens accept. But he insists that only a political and liberal conception of justice, if anything, can attain an overlapping consensus. Call this Rawls's level 1 arguments. Rawls's answer to Q2, the second question, comes in the form of his version of a political and liberal conception of justice, namely justice as fairness, or JF. JF itself has two stages, S1 and S2. The first stage, S1, includes JF's argument from the original position, or OP, to JF's principles of justice. OP lays out a model of rational choice under reasonable constraints. Rawls claims that reasonable people, if they were to choose principles of political justice, would do so as modeled by OP. And he argues that they would adopt JF's principles. Call this Rawls's level 2 arguments. At JF's second stage, S2, Rawls develops the idea of a well-ordered society of reasonable and rational citizens and engages the theme of stability amongst various other things. Roughly, Rawls argues that JF could serve the reasonable and rational citizens of a society that is well ordered by JF itself as a shared basis of public justification that allows them to attain stable agreement in important matters of political justice. And Rawls claims that JF would regulate the society in a way that nourishes cooperative virtues of political life, including especially a willingness to cooperate with others on a footing of equality and mutual respect. Rawls here uses an idea of ideal public justification, and he understands equal respect predominantly in conception-dependent terms. Call Rawls's arguments at JF's second stage his level 3 arguments. What matters for the rest of my lecture are only Rawls's level 1 arguments. These arguments are fundamental in political liberalism's order of justification. They define a framework that Rawls's level 2 and level 3 arguments fill out. Right, and to represent this in the slide, we can distinguish also the roundish bubble at the top. That represents Rawls's level 1 arguments. The rest of the slide represents the two stages of justice as fairness, which evidently are integrated. The original position generates principles that are then put to the test of an imaginary test of stability at the second stage of justice as fairness. Now, at the second stage, an idea of public justification is adopted as part of Rawls's idea of a well-ordered society. This is ideal public justification, and in the current debate, the notion of public justification is often modeled on the way public justification is understood as part of that idea. However, on the reading that I developed further here, there is another idea of public justification, namely an idea that has an essential role at Rawls's level 1 arguments. So at the level of Rawls's level 1 arguments, the question is, what conception of justice can provide the basis for political legitimacy in an actual liberal regime? Well, as we'll see, Rawls basically argues, well, one, a conception of justice that is reasonable. But to be reasonable, that conception must meet a test of actualist and fundamental public justification, which is laid out or entailed in his doctrine of general reflective equilibrium. Or so I shall suggest now.